All right, welcome back to the Tactical Pause podcast. I'm Kevin Price.
I'm Kevin Reed.
And if you haven't done so already, I definitely encourage you to subscribe to the channel. It's really the best way to support what we're doing here. So, what I wanted to talk about today was something that I think has been debated for quite a while now. And I think people know is an issue, but in America, we just keep pushing it off and neglect it. Is our two-party system. A lot of developed countries these days like the UK, Germany, Canada, have more than just a Democrat and Republican Party. But somehow in the United States, we still have the two-party system. Obviously, there are third parties that try to break out, the Forward Party, Green Party, Reform Party, and many others as well. But there's just no viability for them because of the way we're structured and, the way the two-party system has been established. But I want to discuss that and then what mechanisms would have to change for us to get to a space where we're not relying on a two-party system? Because I do think it's possible. I don't think it's possible in our lifetime, honestly, but it is definitely possible.
Um, I don't know. I've been amazed at the people who I talk to who are conservative, Republican, MAGA, whatever, who don't understand that the Democrats are not the left, right? That there are people to the left of them. And so when I tell them, like, no, I'm a socialist, and they're like, wait, what? You're a communist? And so I have to pause saying, no, 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 no. Communism is an entire different government system, right? Socialism is basically saying there you can be rich, but no one should be so poor that they die of things that are preventable, right? It's more of an economic system that's a hybrid of like it's basically like democratic socialism, what Europe has, right? Like we're going to invest so much in these public programs, companies that can't that aren't willing to pay those wages or tax at a higher rate to make up the difference for the people. It's not sexy, I get it, but at the same time, there's a lot of misunderstanding for them, from my experience, on what the left actually is. I think that for a lot of us too, we assume that MAGA is, part of the Republican Party. They do have a stranglehold on it. But I think they're just kind of like a fleeting movement within it. If you look at time from a broad spectrum, 15 years is going to be pretty small. So I don't think it survives Donald Trump. I think that when it's gone, it's going to leave the Republican Party in a really bad spot for a while, because who then takes charge and tries to unify those different aspects of the conservative movement into an actionable party? And maybe this is where it breaks, and this is where we have like the centrist Democrats and Republicans form a new party, and you could have maybe the Republicans become something else, and then you have people on the left, the Democratic Socialists, become the more left party. I could see that. I would like to see that. I think it's important that we have that.
The biggest thing is because I think most American citizens, this is just a belief of mine. I don't know if it's true, but I feel like it is. I think most voters are independent. I really do feel that way, like in their own mind. And that's why we have a lot of infighting within the Republican Party, within the Democratic Party, because you have somebody maybe super progressive, somebody that's moderate, somebody that's more conservative Democrat, and they're all operating under the same tent. So there's obviously going to be some conflict. Some people do not believe in single payer. I've met Democrats that don't believe in the legalization of marijuana or abortion rights or a lot of different things. So to not split it up into different parties to me doesn't make sense. And we're only doing it because we feel like it's not viable to be a third party. That's why most people don't vote for third parties. They say, if I vote, I'm just throwing away my vote. Or say if I vote for the Green Party, which is a left-leaning party, it's a pretty progressive party. But if I vote for the Green Party, I'm throwing away my vote, and it's one more vote for the Republicans. And I don't want that, so I'm just going to vote for the Democratic candidate, which it sucks. And that's essentially what happens to me when I vote. And I don't like it, but I also feel the same way. I don't feel like the candidate's viable.
Yeah, it's a strange environment because you feel on the ground. Like even last couple of weeks ago, the woman who runs Libs of TikTok and that Riley Gaines woman who's claim to fame as tying with a trans swimmer, have both come out and just been over angry at the fact they've received medical bills that their insurance just wouldn't cover. That they have insurance and now they're owed $9,000 to $10,000 after giving birth, and it's like, what's the point of insurance? And I was like, oh, you're right there. You're right there. You're almost there. But this is again Republicans suddenly finding their empathy as the world, the cruelty of the world of the policies that they have created begins to touch them. And so many of those influencers have not had the suffering that a lot of the voters have had, right? Like you don't have an influencer who has to, drive 40 minutes to a hospital because the one in her town is closed, you know. So I think that there is a great need for a people's movement. I think that there's a lot to be said for the PAC movement, how the political action committees can steer elections, can really put a lot of dark money into a lot of places. So I think that if we're really looking at being serious at making viable parties, the first step to that is ending Citizens United and getting rid of all the money in politics, make everything publicly funded, um, and it has to be publicly funded. And I think it should be on non-human trades in the stock market. So a tenth of a penny every time a computer does a stock market trade, which is thousands of times a day. That's what funds your elections.
You know, another big thing that I think has to change in order for us to have more than a two-party system, a viable more than two-party system, is abolishing the Electoral College, which I was reading, it was actually established in 1789, and it was a compromise between the parties because a lot of voters at that time were uninformed. They didn't have the internet, they didn't have social media, they didn't have all these things to inform them about everything that was happening. And a lot of times information moved pretty slow, and they had newspapers, but it wasn't even to the same extent that it is now. And we don't really need an intermediary now. We have as much information, probably too much information at our fingertips now. So I don't see the point in having an electoral college. And it just ends up being a really unethical game of chess. I don't agree with it. I think in order for us to get away from the two-party system, that is one thing that has to end is the electoral college. And the problem with that is Democrats don't want the electoral college to end either. I'm not saying the Democratic voters don't, because I know plenty of Democratic voters that want it to end,
Mm-hmm.
but the Democrats on the top do not want it to end because they know how to manipulate it, just like Republicans know how to manipulate it. And they don't know how that's going to end up. If they do it with electoral college, are we going to be viable as a party? And they don't want that to happen.
Well, and here's the thing: then have the ideas that make you viable, right? If we go and get rid of the electoral college and it goes into one person, one vote, as it should be, if your ideas are where people are, you're going to get elected. That's how it works, right? It's not. I feel like it's an overcomplicated concept because it makes people a lot of money, and that money that it makes them is funneled to that top political elite class. And why change? They have a vested interest in the status quo. Beef fucking $6, $7 a pound. Fuck it. They've got the money for it. So there's a vested interest in keeping that going. I am absolutely against the electoral college. I think it's time. It's been past time for it to go. When it was established too, it was because they thought you needed to have something a vested in white Anglo-Saxon Protestant landowner because you have a vested interest in the country. So you would attend, be the more educated person to make a better choice. So I can see it go. I don't know why people wouldn't. It essentially is saying, you're too stupid to make a good choice. That's why we're keeping the electoral college. Like you're insulting yourself almost by defending it. It's an indefensible thing. Let it go.
Another thing I think that is important, there's a few more things, but open primaries, I think, is something we need. And that's something we have, well, it's a semi-open primary in Washington State. When I was in Texas, and this is probably the same in Missouri, when you go to vote, you have to say I'm voting as a Democrat or I'm voting as a Republican, or if you're an independent, you just don't fucking participate in the primary. And then, the Democrat or Republican wins, and in the general election, you have the Democrat versus the Republican, and the independents are on the ticket too. In Washington State, everybody's on the primary ballot. And so you can actually end up with a Democrat against an independent, Republican against Republican, any combination of that in the general election, which I think is a lot better, in my opinion. But you also need ranked choice voting. And ranked choice voting is very important because you can pick several candidates. You can pick your top candidate, and if that candidate doesn't win because of whatever reason, it moves to the next one. And I've been in situations where I felt like I really would have liked having ranked choice voting, say in a primary, for instance. I supported Julian Castro in the presidential election, and he got such a small portion of the vote that by the time my vote was counted, he wasn't even running anymore. And I'm like, well, fuck. I just threw it. I just threw away my primary vote. It's shit like that that makes me think that we really need ranked choice voting. But I also think a combination of that and open primaries is important.
Yeah, I think too, if you wanted more parties, ranked choice voting is a great way to introduce that too. Because you could essentially say, I'm going to vote my conscience. Let's say there's like a Democratic Socialist Party. I would vote for that party because that's where my heart is. That's where my values are, right? I want some social programs for the neediest. I want to make sure that, everyone gets a good first step in life. But, if that's not a viable candidate, the next person, the next part, might be a Democrat or might be a progressive party person. So I think that's a good way to add other parties. And then it also forces those elected to make a governing coalition. You could almost have a hybrid parliamentary system in which, you still directly elect the president and vice president, but at the same time, Congress has to coalesce around an actual agenda, which forces the president into actually negotiating with Congress on things, actually saying, okay, you guys are all wanting single payer health care. I want this offset so it's not part of the budget, and you actually have to make those things happen. So I could see where that would be good. I could see it where you have a lot of people come out in support of certain, uh, parties based on an agenda from like climate change or energy independence, et cetera. So I think that's also a good way to introduce third parties into the system.
Absolutely. And, another thing is ballot access. Ballot access is very different state to state. Some of it requires petition signatures, some of it requires, pretty high filing fees, which not only makes it difficult for somebody to get on the ballot, and this isn't just for the presidential election, this is for lower level elections too, but I think it makes it more difficult for somebody who isn't more elite. It makes it more difficult for them to run for office. For instance, in Texas, you have to pay over $1,000 to run for office, and then when you're in office as a state representative, you're not paid a livable wage either. So they get paid like 7 grand a year, which is nothing, and then you're pulled away to go to session for several months. So if you're, I don't know, a teacher or if you're somebody that lives paycheck to paycheck and you want to represent your state, you're not going to be able to do that because it's going to break the bank for you. But that's why you end up with these business owners, retirees, elitists, because it's just not viable for somebody else to run for office. And I think that's kind of shitty. I think we
Yeah.
need representation like that. I mean, think about AOC. She was a bartender. I know she gets a lot of shit for being a bartender running for office, but who made the standard that you have to be a lawyer to run for office or you have to be some fucking elite person to run for office? That doesn't make you skilled. I think the only thing that you need is to have a fucking conscience and not to be a fucking idiot. Being a politician is not a fucking skill. It's not. So I wish people would leave that shit out of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, even when I was approached this year to run for a statewide office, it's $150 to register. You have to pay and then you have to pay the party affiliation fees. Would be about $200 initially to get on the ballot, and then you're on your own, right? I'm responsible for getting the Act Blue account. I'm responsible for finding a treasurer. I'm responsible for finding a campaign manager if you need one. Brochures, signs, all that stuff is on me financially. I don't have $15,000 laying around just to throw away like that, especially in a contested race that's going to have very little support, and the high end they think that we cap out as about 40% of the vote, which would be good. But if I have $15,000 just laying around that I want to spend, it's going to be to fix parts of my house, right? I've got home repairs that money would be a better use for than a campaign that is just about a passion for leadership. I have a passion for leadership. I don't have a passion to spend that kind of money that I don't have to just try to get my foot in the door. Like that's not acceptable. It's not something I can do.
And they should also shorten the amount of time that people run. Because think about House members in Congress and the state house, what have you, it's a 2-year term. So at the point that you take office, you're already running for office again
Mhm.
because people usually start running or getting themselves situated to run almost 2 years out, if not more. So at that point, you're running for. I think it should be a 4-year term. I really do, just so that you get in office, you can chill and do your fucking job, and then the election process it should be a couple months. In my opinion, you get out there, you tell people what you're about, you raise a little bit of money if you need to, and you move the fuck on. I don't think it
Yeah.
has to be more complex than that. But we make it that way, but it also allows these big companies to lobby and own our politicians and shit like that, which I just think is terrible. I do.
Oh, I'll tell you, those people like Judicial Watch and um, I don't know, there's some pro-life group. They just keep sending my wife all this spam mail. Like 4 or 5 times a week, she gets something about unborn babies or illegal immigrants or voting rights in Missouri. And I'm sitting here laughing. I'm like, I don't know that what my wife is registered for a party. I don't know that she said so or not, but you know, you can look it up. It's public knowledge. Like there's no attempt. It's just an assumption, right? They're just casting a wide net in order to get as much as they can and keep as many people in as they can. So it's mind numbing how much money they have to just keep sending, you know, dog shit mail to my house. It's like, Sarah, don't you want to protect the unborn? It's like, look, okay, not the way you want to. So and they'll have like these like graphic pictures of aborted fetuses on the envelope. Like, okay, you know what? I understand you're passionate. I understand that this is sort of a personality vibe for you, but let's not spam my mailbox with like graphic parts of fetuses. Please, just we don't need it. It's not going to change my mind on anything. Like, I don't think it'd change my wife's mind, but you know, point taken. You're passionate. It's going straight to the recycling.
And I don't think states are very different on how you register for a party anyway. I know in Texas, you register by voting in that primary. So if you vote in the Republican primary, you're basically considered a registered Republican until the next primary. And then you could vote Democrat, and then they consider you a registered Democrat or what have you. In Washington, I don't think there's a registration. You can become a member of the party, but you're not really a registered Democrat or whatever. So I like that. I think that's a good thing. Another thing is when it comes to races like, say, judges or sheriffs, I don't think those races should be partisan. I
Yeah.
really don't. I feel like it takes away from their focus. There's no reason that somebody who's is a seasoned police officer who's dedicate themselves to that for their life has to get polarized just so they can do what they fucking do. The same with a judge. I mean, obviously people are going to lean one way or another, but they need to be a little more fluid in making decisions because when you're law enforcement, you shouldn't be making the Republican or Democratic decision. You need to make the decision that makes the most
Right.
sense. And I feel the same way
Well,
about judges.
yeah. I mean, I just couldn't imagine like looking at a sheriff and being like, "So what do you think about these tariffs, huh?" And the sheriff's like, "Look, I want to get fentanyl off the streets, and I don't know how tariffs. Like, I can't make a decision on that. I think it's fair to departy, whatever the term would be, to get rid of party affiliations in those elections. It's stupid. Vote for the person who's going to do the best job. When I was first voting, there was two people running for sheriff. Both were running as Democrat and Republican. The Republican was someone I knew took their job way more seriously than the Democrat. And it wasn't because that they were a Democrat. It was because they'd been in office for so long they got comfortable. And I was willing to make the change because I saw that the person who was a former subordinate was better equipped to do the job. And so I think that we'd all like to be able to look at local politicians that way, at who is better equipped to handle the current situation and who would you trust in a crisis. And that should be the parameters.
And it creates elitism at a level where I think we don't really need elitism. In Galveston County, we actually had somebody run as a Democrat for sheriff who actually was a Republican because he wanted to run for sheriff, but he was Republican and he was told to wait his turn. And so he said, you know what, instead of running as a Republican, I'm going to run as a Democrat. he still ended up fucking losing, but um, I feel like it creates an environment where you have to do that because at that point you're lying to voters about who you are, and you shouldn't have to do that. You know, it shouldn't come down to partisanship. Like just like you said, be the professional that you need to be and do the job, and that's all it is. It's a very important role. I mean, police have been under a lot of scrutiny over the last decade or more because of police brutality and things like that. And we could talk about that a little too. I mean, I when I think about, I mean, I'm not a police officer or anything like that, but I understand some of their standards, and I'm sure you do too. And I think some of their standards should be similar to some of our standards in the military. Not saying that the police should be militarized. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that they need to have standards that they stick to. You know, if you're in the army, you take a physical fitness test every 6 months to a year, and if not, they give you a chance to correct yourself, and then after a while they'll kick your ass out. You have to have a height and weight standard. You have to follow. You have to pass your rifle marksmanship. There was a news article. This is pretty old now. This is in the early to mid 2000s. There was a bank robbery. I think it was in New York, and the police got in a gun battle with the robbers, and the police shot 8 bystanders and none of the robbers. I think that's a problem. You know, that's terrible marksmanship, first of all. And then, you know, everybody always makes fun of police officers. They call them pigs and all this stuff, and they get made fun of for eating donuts, and they're always grossly overweight. Now, I want to point out that it can be very different between department to department, and so I know different departments are different, but I think they need to adopt standards that they fucking stick to,
Yeah, I
you
think
know.
that's fair. I also think it's a fair acknowledgement, and I'm coming at this as a teacher, is that a lot of people have put responsibilities, personal responsibility on law enforcement as they have on educators, that they expect law enforcement to be able to handle a mental health crisis. I think there needs to be more resources for that, but that's not their job. And expecting that they're going to handle that, like they're trained to handle emergency situations in a very specific way, and expecting that they're going to come in and be able to discern between someone having a mental health crisis or someone with actual like criminal intent to do bodily harm, I don't know is a fair exchange for them either. So I agree with standards. I think that that's important to hold them to high standards. I also think at the same time, increasing access to like mental health provisions, adding more social workers to departments and cities to help alleviate. So when people like, you shouldn't have to call law enforcement for a mental health crisis. You should have a social worker that is available as part of emergency services to come address that. That would be their job. And I think taking some of that off law enforcement's plate is a good idea. So, it's one thing to recognize they do an essential service for us. I think that there's always going to be a need for police to do investigations for murders and rapes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, holding them to standards where you don't have 8 bystanders being shot, especially in an age of technology where you can easily get license plates, makes, models of vehicles, height, weights, that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of improvements that could be made.
And I also think it's about accountability for police officers because you have, I mean, obviously with a lot of police brutality, which has been in the media more just because of not just against minorities, but I know it's been uh, a really big thing in minority communities, certainly. Um, they're supposed to keep the peace. They're supposed to make people feel more safe. And there's probably are communities where the police are more ingrained in their community. And I think that's great. I think that's how it should be. And, you know, I don't think people should see police officers and be scared. But we're at a point where they are. And I don't blame people for feeling that way because when people fuck up, they aren't held accountable. You know, the police chief says, okay, you're going to go on administrative leave, but don't worry, we got you. And no,
Yeah,
no, that's not how you fucking handle that shit. Like, if you fucked up, you know, if you're found guilty of something, that you're going to be held accountable. Now, if it comes out that you did the right thing, great. Here you go back to work. Do your thing. But I just feel like there's a lack of accountability. And I also feel like they need, in addition to their training, they need to have something. I'm not saying basic training like we have in the military, but something that kind of stress tests the officers as well, because I feel like they're quick to shoot somebody, you know, in a lot of cases because they don't find themselves in that situation. As a police officer, you're not going to find yourself drawing your gun that often. Even in the military,
You know,
we really don't
yeah.
do that often, unless you're infantry, and even then you don't, just depending on where you're at and what your situation is. I know people think it's like that, but it's really not. And then you go through 5 years, 6 years, 10 years in law enforcement. You never have to pull your firearm, and then something happens, and your first instinct is to just pull the trigger. It's
And I think that you see a lot of law enforcement not able to do that, right? When you go back to that school shooting in Texas, right? Where the officers are sitting in the hallway staged up with their assault rifles with one gunman and they can't storm the door. Like there's a lot of issues with that. There's a lot of issues that when they're faced with a moment, can they react? This the same with the school resource officer Stoneman Douglas in Florida. Drew his weapon but didn't go into the building. There's a lot to be said for that job is dangerous. That is an expectation of that job, and if it's something that you can't bring yourself to do, it's not the job for you.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean
and
that's the truth. I feel the same way about the military. That's why I don't believe in having a draft really, because I don't feel like every swinging dick needs to be in the military. I don't feel like everybody's built for it. I mean, I know people that were in the military and aren't built for it. A lot of times in the military, it's very boring. When you're in garrison, back in the States or at your home base, you get your 4 day holiday weekends and get a lot of time off sometimes, but then you end up in Iraq or Afghanistan and you're working every day, and
there's
you might get
no
shot
time
at,
off.
that you might get mortared and it's hostile, and it's a similar situation. But I,
Yeah.
I think we're better trained for it because when we're not downrange, we're training consistently.
Right. Well, and the other thing too is like we are training as an occupying force, right? Like law enforcement and police are not an occupying force. So you don't want to trade, I've seen recent trends in law enforcement training in bigger jurisdictions to trend towards like military style tactics. You're not an occupying force, right? You're going to really irritate people because they're going to feel like you're trying to lord over them. That is not protection and service. That is enslavement. And there's I think a pushback to a lot of those tactics because of that, because yeah, we're not you're not supposed to be an occupying force. You're supposed to be there to make sure that you can resolve disputes, that you can do the necessary investigations to find and hopefully help prosecute the guilt of offenders for certain offenses, and that's it. You're just there to help.
Absolutely. Well, if you did like the episode, I do want to encourage you to subscribe to our channel. It supports us. I'm Kevin Price,
Kevin Reed.
and thank you for joining us again on Tactical Pause.